Anand Rathi Global Finance Limited, Campus and Off-Campus Interview Preparation. Welcome back to the channel. Today we're diving into an essential interview preparation guide for Anand Rathi Global Finance Limited, one of India's well-known NBFCs engaged in loan against property, LAP, LAS, loan against securities, construction finance, treasury operations, and structured lending. These questions are designed based on deep research and our internal interview database. You can use this as a complete preparation pack. Timestamps are available in the description to jump to any specific question. Let's begin. And how would you assess the creditworthiness of a borrower applying for a loan against property? Sample answer. I start with KYC and background verification. Next, I analyze income stability, bank statements, repayment behavior, and obligations. I check DSCR, LTV, and cash flow sufficiency. I review property title, valuation, and legal clearance. Finally, I evaluate credit bureau reports and business sustainability. While answering, always include KYC, repayment capacity, DSCR, LTV, and property due diligence. What procedures do you follow to verify authenticity and marketability of collateral? Sample answer. I examine title deeds, chain of ownership, and encumbrance certificates. I verify municipal approvals, litigation status, and physical condition. Valuation reports are cross-checked with market references. I ensure marketability in terms of location, demand, and resale timeline. While answering, always include title checks, EC verification, legal clearance, and marketability factors. How would you audit margin requirements and valuation of securities in LAS? Sample answer. I check margin policy and compare security value with prescribed haircut. I reconcile pledged securities with depository confirmations. I test daily MTM values and verify price sources. I examine margin call triggers and client responses. While answering, always include haircut checks, depository confirmation, NTM validation, and margin call review. What steps would you take to test mark-to-market for pledged securities? Sample answer. I validate price feeds from NSE, BSE, or authorized vendors. I recompute NTM values independently. I check frequency of MTM and approval hierarchy for corrections. I confirm that MTM adjustments flow correctly into risk systems. While answering, always include independent price checks, NTM recalculation, and approval controls. How do you evaluate financial viability of a construction project finance proposal? Sample answer. I analyze project feasibility, pre-sales, cost sheet, and funding mix. I test assumptions for timelines, cash inflows, and completion risk. I review developer track record and financial strength. I perform sensitivity analysis for delay, cost escalation, or weak demand. While answering, always include feasibility, assumptions, track record, and sensitivity analysis. How do you assess liquidity risk in an NBFC Treasury portfolio? Sample answer. I examine ALM mismatch reports and short-term obligations. I test liquidity buffers such as liquid assets and credit lines. I stress test outflow scenarios. I review concentration of funding sources. While answering, always include ALM, buffers, stress testing, and concentration checks. End. How would you audit controls around Treasury investments in GSECs? Sample answer. I evaluate segregation of front, mid, back office. I validate trades with RBI or clearing counterparts. I check valuation sources, MTM adjustments, and yield curves. I reconcile custody statements with books. While answering, always include segregation, trade validation, valuation, and reconciliation. How do you assess recovery and security realization in borrower default? Sample answer. I review recovery workflow, legal notices, and follow-up timelines. I examine valuation for distress sale and auction procedures. I check documentation for possession, SAR-fallacy, and legal compliance. I analyze historical recovery efficiency. While answering, always include legal steps, valuation, timelines, and recovery tracking. How do you evaluate concentration risk in the loan book? Sample answer. I analyze exposure by borrower, sector, geography, and security type. I compare trends with internal and RBI limits. I check large borrower exposure reports. I run stress tests on top exposures. While answering, always include borrower, sector concentrations, and stress testing. How would you test compliance with RBI's NBFC-ND-SI regulations? Sample answer. I map applicable RBI circulars to compliance checklists. I review capital adequacy, exposure norms, and corporate governance. I verify returns filed with RBI. I test compliance with liquidity norms. While answering, always include regulatory mapping, capital adequacy, exposure norms, and returns. How do you audit provisioning for NPAs and stressed assets? Sample answer. I test aging of overdue accounts and classification rules. I review security value and update valuation reports. I recompute provisions under ECL or IRAC norms. I evaluate management judgment on restructuring. While answering, always include aging, collateral value, provisioning matrix, and NPA classification. End. How do you verify interest income recognition across loan products? Sample answer. I recompute interest using ROI slabs, repayment schedules, and amortization. I verify interest reversal for NPAs. I test fee amortization where applicable. I ensure system calculations match loan agreements. While answering, always include recomputation, NPA interest policy, and system validation. How do you audit end use of funds? Sample answer. I trace disbursements to invoices, bank statements, and ledgers. I analyze whether the funds match sanctioned purpose. I check for diversion to related parties. I review utilization certificates where required. While answering, always include tracing disbursement, invoice linkage, and diversion checks. What documentation checks are essential for securities-backed loans? Sample answer. I verify pledge forms, DP holding statements, and lien marking. I confirm depository freeze instructions. I ensure signed agreements and POA are in place. While answering, always include pledge docs, DP confirmations, and lien validation. How do you assess risk management around margin calls? Sample answer. I check trigger thresholds, notification logs, and client response times. I test automated versus manual triggers. I check forced sale policies and historical margin breach trends. While answering, always include triggers, notifications, escalation, and forced sale controls. End. What reconciliation procedures do you apply between LMS and financial statements? Sample answer. I reconcile loan principal, interest, and fees module-wise. I trace unmatched items to interface errors. I verify cutoff for disbursements and repayments. I check GL mapping consistency. While answering, always include loan GL recon, interface errors, and cutoff. How do you audit disclosures for contingent liabilities and undrawn commitments? Sample answer. I obtain schedules of guarantees, sanctions, and unutilized limits. I review legal opinions. I check disclosure completeness in notes to accounts. While answering, always include guarantee schedules, legal views, and disclosure compliance. What procedures do you follow to audit Treasury investments and valuation? Sample answer. I verify holdings with custodians and depositories. I test valuation of bonds using yield curves and credit spreads. I review impairment triggers and market volatility. I check compliance with investment policy. While answering, always include custody confirmation, valuation testing, and policy compliance. How do you test adequacy of liquidity buffers? Sample answer. I assess liquid investments relative to short-term outflows. I check facility lines and recent drawdowns. I evaluate stress test scenarios. I review ALCO minutes. While answering, always include liquidity ratios, stress scenarios, and ALCO oversight. What internal controls must exist for loan sanction and disbursement? Sample answer. There must be a proper approval hierarchy and maker-checker roles. KYC, due diligence, and legal clearance must be mandatory. Disbursement should only occur after documentation and collateral perfection. System audit trails must be intact. While answering, always include maker-checker, documentation, due diligence, and audit trail. How would you handle audit findings related to encumbered or litigated property offered as collateral? Sample answer. I would first verify the nature of the encumbrance using EC, litigation records, and legal search reports. I would assess whether the borrower and credit team disclosed this during appraisal. I would evaluate impact on enforceability, valuation, and LTV. Finally, I would escalate the finding as a high-risk issue with recommendations for revaluation or additional collateral. While answering, always include title verification, legal impact, valuation implications, and escalation. What steps would you take when securities-backed loans face sudden market volatility? Sample answer. I would review MTM deviations and margin shortfalls. I would examine the timeliness of margin calls. I would validate whether forced sale triggers were activated as per policy. I would check if exposures remained within approved limits after volatility. While answering, always include MTM checks, margin calls, forced sale rules, and exposure monitoring. How do you audit the restructuring or rescheduling of loan accounts? Sample answer. I verify eligibility criteria under RBI norms. I check revised repayment schedules and compare with borrower capacity. I ensure revised terms are approved at the right authority level. I test whether NPA classification is done correctly post-restructuring. While answering, always include RBI norms, revised schedules, approvals, and classification checks. What procedures do you follow to verify accuracy of GNPA, NNPA, and asset quality metrics? Sample answer. I review overdue aging and match it with system days past due. I validate security values for NNPA computation. I test provisioning accuracy for each bucket. I cross-check regulatory reporting consistency. While answering, always include aging, valuation, provisioning, and reporting. How would you test post-disbursement monitoring controls? Sample answer. I examine site visit reports, stock statements, and financial updates. I test timeliness of monitoring activities. I check covenant compliance and borrower communication logs. I verify red flag tracking for early warning signals. While answering, always include monitoring evidence, frequency, covenant checks, and EWS. What audit risks arise in portfolios involving mutual funds, bonds, and equity securities? Sample answer. There is valuation risk, liquidity risk, and mispricing risk. I also assess concentration, counterparty, and operational risks. I test whether price sources and haircuts are appropriate. I check regulatory compliance for investment eligibility. While answering, always include valuation, liquidity, concentration, and compliance risks. How do you verify related party exposures in NBFC lending? Sample answer. I check group structure, beneficial ownership, and CRILC reports. I review board approvals and statutory limits. I test interest rates, collateral, and terms for arm's length nature. I check disclosure accuracy. While answering, always include group mapping, approvals, arm's length terms, and disclosure. What procedures do you follow for KYC and AML compliance in secured lending? Sample answer. I verify identity and address proof, PAN and beneficial ownership. I review risk ratings and PEP screening. I test transaction patterns for suspicious activity. I check periodic KYC updates. While answering, always include KYC docs, AML checks, risk scoring, and monitoring. How would you audit recovery cases and foreclosure processes? Sample answer. I examine legal notices, possession records, and SAR-FASI documentation. I verify auction procedures, valuation, and realization amounts. I test accounting entries for recoveries and write-offs. I review recovery timelines and deviation reasons. While answering, always include legal process, auction checks, accounting, and timelines. What steps do you take to test accuracy of fee-based income, such as processing fees and late charges? Sample answer. I recompute fees as per sanction terms. I test recognition timing and reversal policies. I match ledger entries with loan documentation. I ensure fee waivers have proper approvals. While answering, always include recomputation, timing, documentation, and approvals. How do you audit credit appraisal quality and underwriting norms? Sample answer. I check whether financials, bank statements, and cash flows were verified. I test adherence to LTV, DSCR, and policy criteria. I evaluate risk grading accuracy. I verify approval hierarchy and documentation quality. While answering, always include financial verification, policy norms, risk rating, and approvals. What checks do you perform to validate collateral valuations by external valuers? Sample answer. I review valuation methodology, assumptions, and comparable data. I check valuer empanelment and rotation policy. I test whether valuation aligns with market benchmarks. I flag deviations requiring revaluation. While answering, always include methodology, empanelment, benchmark comparison, and revaluation need. How do you audit income from Treasury investments like government securities? Sample answer. I verify coupon receipts and accrued interest. I recompute amortization of premium discount. I test MTM adjustments and yield calculations. I tie balances to custodian statements. While answering, always include coupon checks, amortization, NTM, and reconciliation. What procedures do you follow to audit impairment of investment securities? Sample answer. I review credit ratings, market yields, and default indicators. I check ECL model parameters and assumptions. I evaluate classification between stage 1, 2, and 3. I test disclosures. While answering, always include rating review, ECL testing, staging, and disclosures. How would you assess the NBFC's liquidity stress resilience? Sample answer. I analyze short-term inflows versus outflows. I test survival days under different scenarios. I review liquidity buffers, unused credit lines, and ALM gaps. I evaluate crisis management framework. While answering, always include inflow-outflow, survival days, buffers, and ALM. What steps do you take to audit corporate governance compliance? Sample answer. I review board composition, committee minutes, and independence criteria. I test related party approvals and conflict of interest policies. I review whistleblower mechanism effectiveness. I check statutory compliance with NBFC governance norms. While answering, always include board structure, approvals, whistleblower, and statutory norms. How do you evaluate effectiveness of internal audit and compliance? Sample answer. I review internal audit scope, sampling, and issue closure rates. I check alignment with risk-based plan. I evaluate follow-ups and escalation mechanism. I assess competence and independence. While answering, always include audit scope, closure, escalation, and independence. What procedures do you follow to assess diversification across products and collateral? Sample answer. I analyze loan mix by product, sector, and collateral. I evaluate correlation risks. I compare diversification with policy limits. I test stress scenarios. While answering, always include product mix, collateral mix, policy comparison, and stress tests. How do you test data integrity and audit trails in LMS? Sample answer. I review maker-checker logs and transaction history. I test edit rights and access controls. I check system GL interface accuracy. I verify date-time stamping for key actions. While answering, always include logs, access control, interface checks, and timestamping. What key metrics would you use for stress testing the loan portfolio? Sample answer. I analyze default rates, LTV deterioration, interest rate shocks, and collateral NTM drops. I test cash flow disruptions and delays. I assess sector-level stress impacts. I evaluate overall capital adequacy post-stress. While answering, always include default rates, LTV, NTM shocks, and capital impact. Thank you for watching, and if you liked our video, kindly press the like button and leave us a comment. This will help us reach a wider audience. Don't forget to check the playlist for more great learning.